My new job is it's a very daunting one, and it's one that bears with it an enormous responsibility. I am the first executive director of the international network of people who use drugs. What we do is to campaign and advocate on an international, regional, national, local level for the human rights of people who use currently illegal drugs. We advance this agenda through the international system, through the UN system. We also help to develop local and regional and national organisations of people who use drugs in countries where they currently exist, and we try to encourage them in countries where they don't exist. Yes. On the one hand, if we look at a wealthy white heroin user living in one of the wealthier countries of the world, you might initially think that they have nothing in common with a poor African living in a slum outside Nairobi. But when you pull back a little bit, you see that both groups of people are faced with certain problems that are very similar. They are human rights problems and there are health problems. Both groups of people suffer very serious degrees of stigma and discrimination, and these impact upon their lives in very, very different ways. And it would be irresponsible of me to compare the life of a wealthy white cocaine user in London to that of a poor injecting user living in a slum outside Nairobi. That would be extremely dishonest of me. Obviously, the way in which stigma impacts upon our lives is very, very different. Some of us are privileged. I mean, I'm very privileged in that I earn my living from being able to publicly identify as somebody who is an active injecting drug user. People who are suffering from multiple forms of discrimination, who are both poor, who are subject to racism, who are living in massive poverty and are also drug users, are multiply stigmatised. And this leads to extreme conditions of stigma and discrimination that are very often fatal. It leaves them deprived of public health tools, an absence of access to sterile syringes and injecting equipment. It leaves them prey to arbitrary detention, punishment, torture, and sometimes killing by agents of the state. So there are massive human rights abuses and also massive problems with the public health. But to say that they're all equal for all people who use drugs across the world would be dishonest, but there are definitely commonalities that face all of us. Okay, I'll address that a bit indirectly. The society that we live in systematically creates scapegoats. And let's pull back a bit from the use of drugs and look at, for example, the history of gay people. Up until 1975 or thereabouts, being gay was classified by the DSM as a mental illness. It was also, and still is in some countries, illegal to be gay. So it's both classified as an illness, but also a criminalised behaviour. In many countries of the world, the agenda for gay people has advanced considerably. And in a lot of those countries, drug users have become the scapegoat du jour. We have become the people whose behaviour is pathologised, is deemed to be an illness, is seen to be morally reprehensible, and is at the same time made illegal. So we're trapped in in three very pathologising, very problematising gazes: a moral one, a criminal one, and a medical one. For INPUD, the agenda is to show that even people who inject heroin daily can live functional, happy, successful, and normal lives if given the tools to do so. Of course, there are people who live all sorts of difficult lives, of which drug use is a part. The problem that we have is that because the dogma of prohibition is so strongly inculcated into people's minds, as soon as drug use enters the picture, it becomes the only factor that is relevant. It becomes the causative factor of why people's lives are problematic or difficult, rather than the fact that, for example, they don't have a house, or the fact that they came from a broken home and were put into foster homes and were abused and beaten as children. So as soon as drug use comes into the question, it becomes the only causative factor, when in many cases it's just a symptom. It's just something that people do to get themselves through very, very difficult circumstances. For other people, they just use drugs because they like them. They enjoy using them. Some people it's a coping strategy. For other people it is a way of self-medicating. So it's a very complex question that needed a complicated answer. I think stigma is one of the most important issues that INPUD deals with. It's one of the areas that cuts across all of the areas of our work. And with regard to your specific question, I think we can say that the stigma and marginalisation that is directed against people who use drugs is very often an active deterrent to people seeking out the health services that they require, and it's very often used as an excuse not to provide people with health services. For example, it's very often argued that people who use drugs are so chaotic that they cannot take antiretroviral therapy. This is an argument that is widely trotted out, and it's demonstrated that people who are injecting drug users are as capable of taking ART therapy as anybody else. The same argument has been made about hepatitis treatment, that people who are injecting drug users are too chaotic to follow treatment for hepatitis, and that's been used as the grounds for denying treatment to people who are currently injecting drug users. So it's a major issue, and it's why INPUD finds common cause with MSMGF, the International Peak Network for Men Who Have Sex with Men, and with NSWP, the International Network of Sex Worker Projects. People who inject drugs, sex workers and MSM are seen as the key affected populations in the AIDS epidemic, but we're very, very often left out of the response. The three of our organisations have been working together because we all face very similar types of stigma and discrimination against our communities that deny us the health services that we need, and that allow the AIDS epidemic to rage unchecked and uncontrolled amongst our communities. One of the objects of INPUD's campaigning this year has been Russia. In Russia, there is no methadone is illegal, and needle and syringe programs are not provided by the government. So the only programs that there are those provided by NGOs. This means that in Russia, approximately 35% of injecting drug users are HIV positive, and in some areas up to 85% are positive. In countries that implemented harm reduction measures early, the figures are less than 1%, sometimes 0.5% of injecting drug users are HIV positive. So this demonstrates very, very well and irrefutably that distributing new sterile syringes is an efficient means of stopping HIV transmission amongst people who use drugs. But stigma and marginalisation is used as a means by governments to deny the provision of those services to our community, all across the world. I mean, America is the global force behind prohibition, and its internal policies are derelict, crude, repressive, and unbelievably backwards in regards to the treatment of people who inject drugs and who use drugs. The return to the federal ban on needle exchange is a colossal step backwards that places the United States on the same level as Russia in this regard. So it's an incredibly regressive step. The use of the war on drugs in America has been an excuse to ramp up their prison population to levels that are unprecedented in the Western world. Prisons are hotbeds for HIV and hepatitis C transmission. There is no needle and syringe exchange in American prisons because the federal government cannot provide for needle and syringe programs. So yes, their policies concern us enormously. We're massively concerned about them. I think there's absolutely no question that harm reduction is under attack in the UK and in several other countries that have historically been very strong defenders. And we cannot afford to sit back and assume that harm reduction is safe in this country. I don't think that there will be ever a repeal of the provision of needle and syringe exchange in this country. But I think that given the reforms in the health service, I think we may well see substantial rollbacks in the number of people who are being provided with methadone. I don't think that's necessarily driven by the ideological agenda of the people that you're referring to, but I think it's more driven by the economic crisis, the changes that are being made to the NHS, and the way in which we continue to be treated as scapegoats. In financial crises, scapegoats always flourish. They're always picked upon, and at the moment we are the scapegoat that is chosen. So I think yes, we really do need to be extremely mindful of what's happening in this country with regards to attacks and harm reduction. I think we have to recognise that provision of services for a community that is as marginalised and as criminalised as ours is never going to be a given. People are not going out of the goodness of their hearts to provide us with the services that we need. And what that means is that we have to actively fight for the provision of needle and syringe programs, for the provision of subsidy programs for people who want them, for wraparound treatment and programs for people who want them, for outreach work for people who need them. And no, it's not just going to be given to us unless we fight for it, unless we demand it, unless our voice is heard at the tables that matter. I think we could look to Portugal as an example of a country that has decriminalised all drug use, although on the other hand what they have done is they have replaced criminalisation with a very strong emphasis on medicalisation. If you are caught once with drugs that were formerly illegal, you get off with a warning. If you are caught subsequently, you can be sent to a medical correction council. So it's immediately being posed as a medical problem. So there are really serious limitations on the Portuguese approach. Nonetheless, it's a really great example of the fact that you can decriminalise the use of illegal drugs. You can do it and see enormous reductions in the HIV rate. You can see people starting to access health services in ways that they were previously afraid to do. You can see that it leads to changes in the way that people perceive people who use illegal drugs. So yes, Portugal is a good example. The Netherlands has always been looked upon as a pretty good example, although we're beginning to see even some retrenchment there. Although my Dutch friends are fairly sceptical as to how far the government will actually be able to roll back the harm reduction policies that are in place in the Netherlands. There are other countries that make very good provision for their injecting drug users, but again there are always limitations. Germany and Switzerland both provide, for example, heroin on prescription, but there are limitations in that you have to attend the clinic 2 or 3 times a day to receive it. And what this does is to turn you into a full-time attender at a clinic. If you have to attend the clinic 2 or 3 times a day, it's very hard to hold down a full-time job. So there are problems with the way in which this has been done, and it's a great shame because the UK had a very long and very good tradition of always prescribing heroin to people who found that they needed it or wanted it. But that system has been allowed to wither on the vine and die away very slowly. It was prescribed just like any other drug. You receive a prescription from your doctor and collect it from the pharmacy. There was no need to consume it on the premises. It was quite deproblematised, quite destigmatised, and was treated in a very good way. But that's been allowed to die away, and it's a really sad loss to this country.